on the technology, but oh my gosh, release the flying monkeys. Good morning, afternoon, night, whenever you are viewing this segment here with the 4Bs. We are the 4Bs, three older white fat guys, and then I guess a Gen Z. I have no idea about this, who talk about the Constitution of American life here. And the reason I said release the monkeys is I just some news from this day that we are broadcasting. I'm trying to figure out which one of us has the dumbest senator, since we're going to be talking about the Philadelphia Convention. And I'm going to paraphrase. I don't remember the exact quote, but the greatest collection of human minds in one place at one time in human history, something like that. And then I think about the modern Senate, and I'm not a real fan of Feinstein and wish he'd resign. And then last week I think I shared with Mr. Kavanaugh that Senator Kramer, oh man, that guy's pretty insightful there. But I gotta say, Mr. Moore, Senator Johnson takes the prize. All right, this was not an insurrection because they didn't have AR-15s.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking we should invite him to State Street in Wisconsin. Have a little tunnel there of students, and they can beat him with brooms, and he can decide whether or not those are weapons. Yeah. I'm so sorry.
I think Lyndon Johnson had a quote that's not fully repeatable, but he's our So yes, he's our native son.
Yeah. So is that like Gene Kilpatrick? He may be a dictator, but he's at least our dictator.
Yeah, some variation of that. Yes.
Some variation.
I think I remember the Johnson quote, just the President Johnson quote, just that way, Tim.
But da 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 da.
Yeah. Well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about from the We the People book for national finals, a Unit 2 question, which deals with the drafting of the Constitution, the ratification, and the debates surrounding that. And specifically, we want to look at both the unresolved and resolved problems of Philadelphia. And if we have time to maybe look at some, possible contemporary changes we'd like to make there. But I'm just curious, my question to you guys is, other than what age you had to be as a citizen to run for office, is anything else actually resolved? And it's one of these, questioning the premise of the question that we encourage students to do. And I looked at this and I thought, is anything really resolved? So what are your thoughts about that, about the legitimacy of the question and then my question itself?
Well, there's a yes and no, I think, to that, Dave. I mean, it's a good question. I think the no part, I mean, we can go through all those things, but the yes part might be the fact, remember, these cats fully expected this to last a generation or two max. I mean, that was kind of the lifespan of constitutions when they were doing this. So, for these as you phrased it, and the question phrases it as unresolved issues, in part is a function that we still are working with this text to some degree. So, I mean, it's counterfactual, counter-historical. If that Constitution only would have lasted, say, a generation or two, would we be talking about the unresolved conflicts? Well, no, because we wouldn't have that system. So a part of the question is complicated by the fact that the text is still around.
Yeah. Chris or Mike?
Well, I think I think we alluded to the small c and big C constitutionalism, right? The big C constitutionalism, David, as you mentioned, like the age of holding office. We know that. This spells it out. We know that, right? But the small c stuff is the white space between the black letter law. And I think, and my analogy is cheesy, and I've always used it, though. We call these guys framers. And, and why do we call them framers? Because they gave us a framework. And, it's like you build a house, you put the frame up. And then once you put the frame up, you put on the electrical, you do the plumbing, you do the drywall, you add a room, you take a room down. It's like HGTV, right? And it's constantly in process. And so have we resolved anything? Is that the question? Have we actually resolved? Did the Constitution resolve anything? I would say, God, yes. I hate to do it. I'm going to copy Professor Moore. Yes and no. More so that it gave us a way to resolve things. Because think about it. In 1788, who was we the people, right? Who was we the people? It's white male property owners. And so it gave us a way, and eventually to move forward, to amend it, to change it, to help us resolve something. So it gave us the tools, right, to be able to, add that room, to continue that analogy, to continue the remodel that we need to constantly do. And we're constantly resolving issues in terms of who we the people are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would even make the stronger argument. I love it that you're questioning the premise.
So you were saying my argument's not strong? Is that what you're saying?
No. The argument is very strong.
Well, I'll say that, Chris.
It was very, very strong, Chris. Extremely strong. Like Chris's idea about the framework, I kind of always see them as this idea that they could create a government like it was a machine that was going to have all these moving parts, right? And they really thought that they could design something. And what they resolved, I think, were the big questions about that machine. I mean, the big questions about divisions between federal and state power, the big questions about the power of Congress, the big questions. And I think they knew that they were going to have to work out how that machine was actually going to run itself. But the document they came up with was a very different document than the Articles of Confederation. And to walk out of that convention and to have a consensus over a new structure, a new framework, I don't think we can take that too lightly. I think that was a pretty big lift for all the delegates.
Well, I'm kind of with Chris. I mean, can anything be resolved if you have an Article 5, which provides for amending the Constitution? So I want to say, Chris, I'm glad that I think that's what you were implying. The fact that they had the amendment process in some way implies that nothing's really resolved, other than maybe, I guess, the concept of representation. Because I was literally thinking about this. I mean, I know what textbooks say, but I'm trying to think, okay, what was resolved? Well, we know that, other persons in shackles, slavery was not resolved. Other than, I guess, the Senate.
That's it, David. You're right. They said you can't screw around with representation in the Senate. They resolved something. We can't abolish the Senate. Done deal. I think Chris's point is really important here. It's unresolved because we're stuck with little c, the white spaces. And that's our history. It's in the interpretation of a very vague framework. So the unresolved, I think, has something in part or parcel to do with the little c dynamic to our system.
Well, and I want to go back to the Article 5, the amending process. And of course, I don't want to jump right into presentism because it might be virtually impossible to amend the Constitution today. But I think it gives us a chance to resolve the issue where we are at the time. Does that make sense? So, you think about the 13th Amendment. It gave us a chance to get rid of slavery after the Civil War, to resolve at that point in time. So does that mean we've resolved all those issues? No, because if you look at the wording in the 13th Amendment, it allowed for Jim Crow to take hold in the South, and basically to criminalize being Black in some places in the South. And so, did it resolve the issue of slavery at the time? Yeah, it abolished slavery. It's written into the Constitution that slavery will not be permitted except for these other, things that they spell out in
Yeah.
Article 1 of the 13th. So it resolves the issue at the time, but not for all time.
Well, let me pose the question to the group then. If they solved, do we think they solved the problem of keeping the South in the Union at that time?
Well, yeah, because the North beat their ass. Oh, wait, sorry. Yeah.
Wait, are you saying again? I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the trail here. Are you saying did they resolve the question of keeping the South in the Union? What with with the Civil War or with
No. I mean, Chris's point was we resolved issues at that time, and so I mean we know what's coming down the American timeline here. But at the time, did we solve that problem of keeping the South in the Union?
Well, obviously, I think concurring with it temporarily, we did. If I understand it, most of the compromises, it seems to me, are driven by that idea. Both representation and then the slavery, the two of the biggest compromises, are to keep those southern states in the Union. And so we end up with a Union, and we end up with the United States of America. Now the question is, and I think everybody understands, it was maybe a Faustian bargain,
Sure.
that it was very much short-term thinking and probably way too much faith in the long-term virtuous ability of representation to carry out that compromise there. Mike?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about, Chris has often made the point about the Declaration and about independent states, and then thinking about the Articles. I mean, I don't think it resolved the question of were we one nation, but it definitely put into play with we the people, right? It put in a different ingredient into the mix, right? For the Southern and Northern delegates to sign on to a document that starts with we the people, again, is a pretty big move for that period in American history. So I don't think it resolves it, but it reframes how we think about ourselves in ways that was really different during the Revolution and under the Articles, I think.
I was thinking maybe another, David, to your original question, did we resolve anything? I'm thinking maybe when the South originally insisted at the convention on a supermajority for commercial treaties. And they felt like they'd been stung by the negotiations over the Jay Gardoki and the access to the Mississippi. So at the convention, they wanted, and if that had gone through, they would have really been screwed. So at the convention, they wanted a supermajority for commercial treaties. Well, the bargain that they reached to abandon that requirement was the 3/5 clause. So even that one seemed to be, yeah, we resolved that, commercial treaties could be a simple majority. That's continued. But the 3/5 clause was the other part of that bargain that obviously comes to play down the road of history. So maybe on commercial treaties we resolved it to some degree.
So
I think
go ahead, Chris.
Well, no, I'm just going to go back to your original question, David. Did we resolve anything? Does the Constitution resolve? Is that the original question?
Yeah, I question
I want to go back to my original answer, and I say it gives us the method for resolving, and not just through the amendment process. Because now I want to go back to and I always use this with my students as the Pacificus Helvidius debates, because here you've got Madison and Hamilton duking it out over executive power. They're arguing about what they believe is possible for the president to do as the Constitution is just in its infancy. And my point is, if these two guys are going to argue over its interpretation, how are we not going to argue over its interpretation? And does that there you go. You hold up a little higher, please.
No, I'll get to it when you're done.
Okay. So the idea is that it gives us a method, but there's, I mean, something in terms of executive power. These guys are arguing over whether the president can unilaterally pull us out of a treaty. And they just were at the convention. They just wrote the darn thing, right? Madison's called the father of it, and they're arguing about its interpretation. So I think, it gives us a method for resolving for the time being, until we have to resolve it again, until we revisit the issue again. When you ask students what a constitution is, one of the answers is probably going to be a rule book. It's a rule book for our government. What can our government do? What can it not do? And when we have doubts or questions about the call, we go to the rule book. So it gives us that method for resolving.
I think a really great book that's just come out by Jonathan Gnapp at Stanford. He's actually the guy that's going to replace Rakoff. And the book is The Second Creation, and it connects to what Chris is saying. Gnapp basically says, look, the first Congress did more resolving of issues. And it actually has a lot to do with where do you go for original intent too. But that's kind of a side issue. But to our discussion, his thesis is there's a lot of white space in the Constitution. So the first Congress has to resolve those vague phrases. And he looks at four case studies, the bank bill, the removal bill, the Jay Treaty, and I forget what the fourth one is. But his thesis is they are resolving unresolved or vagueness in the Constitution in the first Congress. And I think that goes to Chris's point. There's an arena to resolve that was set up. And Gnapp says that one of those arenas was the first Congress. He also kind of says there also a second constitutional convention as a kind of a sub-thesis.
I guess my struggle is again, and I probably overthink some of this stuff, and I know students may do that. Is this concept of resolved there? So if resolved means that temporarily we've created a barrier so we won't, gouge each other's eyes out, then I guess, okay, there are some, there is some resolution to some things. And then, the flip side of this topic that the kids have is what was left unresolved. And, again, to me, that seems somewhat redundant if indeed we interpret the term resolved as to mean in the short term there.
I see where you're going, Dave. I guess I disagree a little bit. In terms of the question, what were the major disagreements? Well, I would argue, and I'm on shaky ice here because I know Tim and Chris know the history much better. A major disagreement walking in was, how is representation going to work? Like, who is going to have power in this new form of government? And then it says, well, how is that resolved? They made a heck of a lot of compromises, except for making sure the Senate would not go away, right? But then once you do that, once you set up the framework, to get to Chris's point, our Constitution has fewer words in it than most other constitutions in the entire world, right? So what does it mean? Like, what power does the executive actually have in terms of making a treaty? Well, that's not something that they could resolve in the confines of the convention. So I think they did resolve a major issue of representation and a major issue of separation of powers. But then within that, there's all these unresolved issues that go with, okay, what happens when a Hamilton is pushing this point and a Madison's pushing back on this point? The system was set up so to have those discussions within this compromised framework.
But that's my struggle here, Mike, is that, and again, I think you said it very well, but that means everything is unresolved.
But wait, David, are you comfortable or uncomfortable with us being British?
Am I comfortable or uncomfortable with us being British?
Well, let me explain. It's a stupid question.
Yeah, it really was, because it's 17.
No, here, I'll try to do better. We always, Americans, we kind of always pat ourselves in the back that we have a written constitution. the Brits are real squishy because they don't have a constitution. It's whatever Parliament wants. We got enumerated powers. We got all this written constitution. Well, the question, I think we've kind of been dancing around here. Are we okay with kind of being a little more British in our orientation of how our constitution works than what we might conceive ourselves to be if we have a written and enumerated system? It seems to me that we're very British in that sense. So the unresolved issue for me personally isn't that big of a deal because I kind of see us as very British in that way.
Well, let me ask, is involuntary servitude and its place in our constitutional republic, is that resolved or unresolved? And I throw that to all three of you. That's my difficulty with this.
Duvernay would say no.
And thank you very much. All right. Yeah, I wasn't planning on going down that path of.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, somebody else could explain that better than. That was just kind of a smart aleck comment, but somebody else might want to play that out a little bit more than me.
Well, again, that I'm trying to approach this, as back in the days when I coached We the People. I'm trying to help kids, and here's my frustration. That question, I just asked you a question, and again, Tim, you're one of the brightest and most informed people about the period, but you want to punt. Right? You want to punt that question away to Williams or Kavanaugh there, and that proves my point that this question is either overly simplistic or so complex that kids can get lost in the dark hole of of definitions. Mr. Kavanaugh.
I would say about overly simplistic or complex, yes. It's the low hanging fruit. Well, yeah, I think there's two ways to approach it. I think the low hanging fruit for kids would be what was resolved. Okay, we're going to have a Senate. We're going to divide the legislature up into two branches. We're going to have an elected president not appointed. We're going to have a Supreme Court. So we're going to have the three branches. We're going to get out the basic stuff. So that was resolved, right? And so the unresolved things would, of course, be the issue of slavery, the issue of citizenship, who we, the people, are at the time. Those are the unresolved things because that's going to be left up to the states to decide. And we know through the process and through our many discussions, that doesn't really happen until what year, Mike? 1960 what?
64, baby.
Thank you, 1964. So, but I think for kids at the national level with this question, the answer is back to what Dave's been posing with is no, because it hasn't really resolved anything. I don't know that. I think when you think of it that way, no, because we're still debating this very stuff that they were debating back then. And I'm going to steal one of Tim's favorite words, and that's sovereignty, right? Who has sovereignty? Who has this power? Is it the first three words, we the people? Is it an unelected Supreme Court? Is it a Senate that is now, holy cow, so out of whack with what they intended? The world's greatest deliberative body, my eye. So have we resolved these issues? Yeah, I cleaned that up. My eye.
You're really struggling tonight, Chris.
8 hours to Bozeman. Remember that? 8 hours to Bozeman.
Yeah.
Sounds like a country western song. All right.
Well, it would fit right in. So yeah, I think that's. I'm not trying to be snarky to your original point, Dave. Is it simplistic? Is very simplistic. For a nationals question, is very simplistic. But for a team that's really hoping to separate itself at the national level, take it from Dave's point that nothing is resolved. Very little is resolved. Think about what we're talking about with this white space in terms of things. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say it more like.
Was that a good argument?
It was a great argument. You're on fire.
It was semi-strong.
It's hard because I feel like we keep moving back and forth in time, right? Things are resolved until they're not. I would disagree with you a little bit, Chris. It was as of when the Constitution is adopted, we have resolved to be a slave republic. That's decided. And that doesn't change. That doesn't change until 1865. Now, immediately there's pressure and immediately there's new questions about moving out west. But we decided in this document that we are a slave republic until otherwise. So now I can see the flip side. Well, of course we know the history, so slavery is unresolved, but it's only unresolved if we fast forward 70, 80 years and understand that it got to a point of a new type of political debate. So.
Agreed.
I mean, they were still talking. There was a little rumblings in ratification about secession. There certainly was rumblings about secession in the War of 1812 with the Hartford Convention. So, I mean, I like your point, Mike. It's resolved until it's not. Well, we came kind of close to secession in 1814. These wacky Connecticut, ex-federalists. So,
That's good.
yeah, I like that. It's resolved till it's not.
That's the very essence of 19th century existentialism. All right, we're resolved until we're not. And also good advice for relationships. There kind of thing. So,
real quick for the students too, the one thing I would tell you to go to based upon that last 3 minutes of conversation is check out the last thing Madison had published called "Advice to My Country," published after his death. Right. It's a real short little thing. "Advice to My Country," Madison published right after his death, about the Union and the perpetual nature of the Union. It'd be interesting for students, I think, to check that out in terms of what we're talking here. Mike setting us up for the discussion about the Civil War and Tim's discussion about secession early in the Republic with those damn Yankees. So check that out, students.
So I've got to ask Professor Williams a specific question, and I'm going to, turn it over. Hopefully, some of you have some other questions here. But Professor Williams, is federalism resolved or unresolved?
You've been a great audience, Cleveland. See you next week.
Were you asking me in 2021 or in 1789? Where are we at?
No, I'm staying true to the question. I am talking about 1789. Is federalism, would you put it as, or coming out of the convention, I guess, the ratification, is federalism resolved or unresolved?
I would argue it's resolved in the very broad contours that we have a national government of limited power. And in what was supposed to be the most important, most powerful branch, Article 1 specifies exactly what Congress can do. Now, I know that students, we can talk about necessary and proper, we can talk about commerce, but yeah, at that moment, I think we are a country that it is resolved where the national government has very limited powers and most of the governing is going to happen at the state level.
Okay. I'll give you a B+ on that answer there. So fine job.
I'll push back with Knapp. His argument is probably not, because the first Congress is fighting about some of those basic issues again. And remember, alien sedition was a federalism issue in some ways, because it produces the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But that there's tremendous blowback on the overbearing, overpowerful, centralized government. So yeah, at the time, that very narrow window in '88, okay, but we're into the mid-90s and they're really fighting about it.
I haven't read Knapp, but I would argue that debate is taking place in a context where every state has 2 senators. Yep. And sure. They're debating it, but they're debating it within constraints that they made for themselves that define the federal system in a lot of ways.
So it would be fair to say we're essentially saying they resolved structure but did not resolve policy.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to say that, Chris?
I would agree with that too. And I was just going to remind students, don't forget those senators that Mike was alluding to. They were elected by state legislatures, right? So therein lies the state interest in the national level, with a Senate that is determined, elected by state legislatures, there to represent the states. Therefore, you have the equality of the states regardless of the population, which again will be what I have ranted about many times on this.
David, you shook your head no. Yeah, that was a vicious no.
Yeah, and I think it's in that no man's land of are we talking about 2021 or 1789? And again, to me, the Bank of the United States is not necessarily a policy question. It is much more of a powers question as far as the economic, vibrancy and of this country. And they have a major debate that's coming out pretty much right out of the chute there.
Right.
So if federalism is not resolved, there's not a structure to it, because we don't even know whether or not we can have a national bank, because either intentionally or unintentionally they left that out of Article 1, Section 8. And so we had to have a major debate, of which continues for what, 6 decades?
Yeah.
This debate of whether or not we can have a national bank, so I don't think there's this separation, this easy separation of policy and structure, because I think there's some functions that they debate that are structural, even though they may on the surface seem
David, I don't know. I mean, it seems like you're advocating for a constitutional text that would have been much more detailed, but I know you well enough to know that you wouldn't like you don't like the South African Constitution because it's too detailed, right? So it seems like you kind of want to have it both ways. I mean, did you want them to put it in the text that there could be a national bank? Is that your argument?
Yeah.
Well, that was easy.
And again, like all of us, I've evolved. All right, like the current president and many presidents, I've evolved on this, and there's a certain romanticism and I guess intelligence to all of these white spaces that Kavanaugh talks about, but it seems to me the white spaces overwhelm like a virus the actual text there, and that the actual text has been devoured by this white space virus of ambiguity.
But David, the good news is the judges wear black robes, and they've been vaccinated with those black robes from the virus that you just so eloquently explained.
David, do you not agree with Marshall and McCullough v. Maryland?
Of course I do.
Well, there you go. Then you can. He's right there in the Constitution and the necessary.
But heart of Atlanta, heart of Atlanta's a stretch, man.
Well, I'm going back to the national bank. I'm going.
Come on.
Well, I would go back.
Come on.
If you just want to focus on the national bank for now, Professor Moore, but the whole idea, I would go back to my boy James Wilson talking about the inherent power in the national government to have a bank, and he's writing about that prior to the convention.
Yep.
He's writing about that under the Articles, that there's this inherent power to have a bank. It only makes sense to have for a national government.
Well, and functionally, I mean, as you know, functionally under the Articles, they essentially do have one. Which is an irony.
Was that Morris?
Morris.
Morris, yeah. So come on.
So I'm going to defer. Somebody else have a question that they think will enlighten the students there, that you think another direction we need to go in?
No, I just would reiterate what I said. I think the many students will approach it, and teachers will approach it from the low-hanging fruit. These are the issues that were resolved. What was unresolved would be the issue of slavery, the issue of citizenship, the issue possibly of federalism, which is an ongoing argument. But I think that for kids that really want to really tear this apart and deconstruct this question is to take the Dave Richmond approach and ask if anything was really resolved. Yeah. I think that I would encourage kids to really tackle it that way, because that's going to get you knee deep in the weeds and a lot of stuff and a lot more interesting discussion.
I would say maybe we've talked about this in other meetings, but the role of political parties. And I'd be curious if, like, in terms of, I don't think that was resolved at the time. And the question asked, what were the consequences of that? So could we envision, I don't know, what would it have looked like if political parties are mentioned in the Constitution, and would that have served the Republic better, I guess?
I think in the long term, it would have benefited, because, now we get to some legalism. One of the biggest barriers to, and this kind of fits to the last bullet on changes we might like to see, one of the biggest problems, especially in the last 50 years, is that we can't regulate parties, because they're extra constitutional, if that's the right term, or they're private entities, if that's the right term. Therefore, they're under this umbrella of the First Amendment. We've seen the difficulty that we face in trying to regulate parties. If they would have inserted parties, let's say in Article 1 of the Constitution, they could have implied, therefore, some limits on parties there. So that's my sense of, if they would have done that, Mike. I think in the long term, we would have seen less damage done by parties if they would have put them in Article 1.
I used to think that the failure to mention political parties in the Constitution was a failure, but I still might believe that. But I just pose this question to everybody: coming out of the Revolution, I mean, even before we declared independence in the First Continental Congress, there were parties. There were those who were, I think there were three parties actually. There were Tories, there were radical patriots, and then there were kind of the moderates. And I would pose the question: coming out of the American Revolution, could they have addressed addressed parties? Because so much of the factional discussion during the Revolution, during the 80s, during the convention, and certainly in ratification, it was, there's one party who are patriots, and then the other party are British Tories. They're royalists. So for them, I mean, that's the political party context. So I've often thought the reason they don't mention parties is because it is so viscerally connected to one party's being royalist. And maybe they wanted to avoid those kinds of labels in the early republic by creating this system. So I understand that, but I think at the time there's such a legacy, a negative legacy of one of the parties in our system at that time.
And I would just push back on something David, you said, was that we can't regulate parties today. And I would disagree. I think we choose not to. I think we can. I think we can. And you can look at things like McCain-Feingold, or in terms of that's spending issues. I think we could if we had the political will, but we don't have the political will to do that today. When I say we, I'm talking about the people that we elect, right? Which may get us into the second question, but I think we choose not to regulate parties today. It's not that we can't. We have the mechanisms to do that. We choose not to, which is frustrating. And Tim, to your point, in terms of parties, right? Parties existing, would you say that those are parties or more factions? Because this is the whole debate about factions versus party, right? And I don't know if I would call them necessarily parties, as more I would call them factions.
Well, I'm gonna defer to Jack Rakoff on this one. He says they were. I'm also reading a book right now about the First Continental Congress, and I'm almost convinced that they were.
That they're parties.
And again, they avoid using. I think what I'm picking up on, I think they avoid using the term because they don't want to be associated with parliamentary parties. I mean, there's such. So I think I'm prone to say that they were, Chris. I'm not going to die on that hill, but I mean, and it's a fair question.
I mean, I'm going to argue with Rakoff. I mean, he's such a hack. I mean, come on. And students, for any students watching this, that was a facetious comment. Jack Rakoff, Stanford historian, Rakove. Pick up anything that he writes, read it. You don't have to agree with it, but you'll be well served.
Political parties in the Continental Congress I think it was his first book, actually. But
Tim, I'm wondering, because it's been a long time since I've read that Rakoff piece. But in political science, the main way we distinguish between political parties and interest groups, what might be considered factions, is that political parties recruit and nominate people to run for office. And I'm just thinking whether even in such a limited democracy of what we had in 1789, is that happening? But it's not happening.
Oh yeah.
but
Oh
it's not
yeah,
to the
there are
extent.
political machines. George Clinton is a political machine in New York. Patrick Henry is a political machine. I mean, yes, I say they are.
But is it a political machine? Like,
Yes.
but is it Clinton's machine versus Clinton is trying to nominate people under a certain faction or party that would represent what? His views? Because that to me, that's much more like the kind of personal politics that I teach down in, in sub-Saharan Africa, rather than kind of mass political parties.
Well, yeah, potato.
All right.
Another great book is Joanne Freeman's book on the early discussions in the 90s. To your point, her argument is political parties develop out of personal loyalties.
Right.
And so they're all kind of making it up as they go through the 1790s. So that's Joanne Freeman's argument. Yes. That's why I say I'm not going to die on this hill, but I just wanted to kind of give maybe a different perspective on that.
Well, any other, again, I think Dr. Williams is very insightful there, that parties were an unresolved issue because we know that it's on the radar. The parties are part of their life. Are there any other areas that you consider? I would say federalism is unresolved, but we've had that discussion. I would say presidential powers is unresolved. But maybe that's naive and narrow-minded, as I tend to be there. So I'm curious. Mike's done a good job with political parties. Any other areas that you would consider unresolved?
I would issue a warning to students: do not say judicial review was an unresolved issue, because everybody knew it was going to happen, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So don't make that mistake, please.
It was already happening. So yeah, it was at the state level. Yeah. Unresolved again. I go back to the beginning, who we the people are, because that's an issue that really is not going to. Well, how many times is the word citizen or citizenship used in the Constitution prior to the 14th? It's used a number of times, but it's never really, and I know this is in the textbook as well, but it's never really resolved because we're going to let the states decide that. So that is an issue. I do think that, even though I might call that low-hanging fruit, but I do think that is an issue that is not really resolved, because who gets to be we the people?
Yeah.
And I think honestly, to a degree, we're still struggling with that today.
Yeah.
You think about the poor, not to jump into a bunch of presentism, but if you think about the poor kids that were DACA recipients, right? Under the Obama administration, then under the Trump administration, now back to the Biden administration, the idea that these kids were brought here from a young age through no fault of their own, what is their status going to be? So we still struggle with it today. So I'm not saying that it's resolved, but I do think that's an unresolved issue from that time.
Yeah. I have two more that as I was thinking about this, I'll just throw them both out there and see if anyone wants to talk about them. Seems to me like the Bill of Rights, this idea that something had to be done in terms of outlining individual rights at the convention, but they kind of punted it and said, we're going to take that up later. And then the second issue was, how do I say this? The way the executive branch was going to work in terms of the vice presidency, right? We get an amendment pretty quickly, because what they had actually created was kind of a plural executive branch, where you could have folks in executive branch from different factions or parties. Those are the only two other issues I thought that maybe coming out of it, they weren't quite sure of, knowing they were going to have to work on it, but not quite sure how.
Well, in one of our previous sessions, Professor Moore enlightened me about the 9th and 10th Amendment, that one was created to appease the Federalists and another one was created to appease the Anti-Federalists, which meant that nobody believed really in anything other than political, compromise or whatever. But let me see. The Bill of Rights is interesting, because I don't know if it's unresolved, I think that the Bill of Rights in its initial creation is meaningless, and in fact I think it's meaningless for over 100 years. It's let's throw the Anti-Federalists a carrot of empty promises, because the Congress shall make no law means that the Bill of Rights, and we all know this by the judicial history and by the history of litigation. I mean, how many cases dealing with the Bill of Rights exist in the first 70 years? One.
And and the real hardcore anti-federalists saw that, David. You're exactly right. They saw the Bill of Rights as an absolute waste of time, because they didn't want just simple rights. They wanted a lot more structural amendments to the Constitution. Yeah. So you're right. Even the anti-federalists knew that that Bill of Rights was a sop.
Right. And I would like to just add on, Mike. I think we have the enumerated rights that we need to have that are commensurate to the powers of the national government. And those rights are found in the body of the Constitution. Habeas corpus, Bill of Attainder, that's the one area of wisdom that I see in the founders framers, is that they understood that, for every commensurate power, you need to have maybe a right or a limitation, and they take care of that. And the rest is all powers that are not enumerated to Congress. Congress theoretically has no power. Now, I understand that within 10 years, they're going to exercise what I consider unconstitutional power, something that's been affirmed, in our history. But there's no power, in the Constitution to abridge the freedom of speech. I mean, where do they find that? In Article 1, Section 8? So in a sense, I think it's resolved, and that's why, Madison is like, oh, okay, fine, we'll give you a Bill of Rights. And, and again, there's this Bill of Rights that we celebrate, but it has no meaning for the first, 100 and something years of our history.
And by getting a Bill of Rights, here's another one they solved. By getting a Bill of Rights, they resolved not having a runaway second convention. There, they solved that.
I agree that they weren't super meaningful, but I still think, like, my history is right? At the convention, Madison and others say, okay, we hear this at the ratification process. We hear this complaint. We promise that we're going to put something together for you. Okay. But what that something is unresolved. And we all know that one of the things one of the amendments that didn't pass looked very much like the current Equal Protection Clause.
Yep.
What are the consequences if that were part of it? So I agree with you. They didn't mean a lot. But I think it was unresolved about, is it going to be a right to expression or a right to conscience, right? What's going to be covered in these amendments? How are you going to word it? I think those were important questions, despite the fact that they were super limited at the time.
Just a nerdy point of history here, Mike. It's a ratification where that occurs, not in the convention. At the convention, they told George Mason to sit down and shut up.
No, thank you.
It's ratification where your point.
Well, now I have three things, and not two, because that made me recall. And for the students, I'm going to quote Professor Akil Reed-Amar, why we don't have a Bill of Rights. And he said it's because the framers are hot, horny, and homesick. So if you could bust that out, that might be really good. And that's straight from Amar.
Elbridge Gerry was.
Well, yeah, clearly. But why they told Mason to sit down and be quiet. Two, this is the thing that there's this idea exists that we'll ratify conditionally, right? There's this idea of this conditional ratification, and I don't know who keeps this alive. And Tim, you could address this better than I, but I don't ever, it's like conditional ratification. Okay, we're going to ratify, but you need to give us a Bill of Rights. No, I don't know that really truly happens. And
it starts in Massachusetts, and essentially it's like, no, ratify it up or down, and we promise. So the conditional, it occasionally shows up in later conventions, but essentially the precedent in Massachusetts is there's no conditional.
Right. Yeah. So that's the thing that kind of bugs me, that somehow that's people have talked about that. And, you know, Madison, for putting this idea, Bill of Rights out there, I think, and again, I think there are three major areas in terms of that. One is to prevent, like Tim just said, a second runaway convention, to protect the Constitution, even though he doesn't necessarily like everything in it. He thinks it's the best thing that they could do. Two, I think the influence of Jefferson on Madison is a big deal. The letters written back and forth about the need for a Bill of Rights. And three, he wants to win an election. I mean, the Patrick Henry's machine that Tim just alluded to kept him out of the first Senate. And he's got to, you know, come back and run against his neighbor, James Monroe, and he has to make a campaign promise. If you elect me, I'll do this. And he does. I mean, and he calls it a nauseous project. So, you know, is that resolved? Yeah, but those are the reasons why it's resolved. And again, to Dave's point, those are things that don't come into play for how many not hundreds of years, but over 100 years. It really doesn't mean anything to us. And even though the Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Act.
And students, probably the go-to case to prove the Bill of Rights is meaningless is maybe the Barron versus Baltimore. That might be worth looking at to David's point and Chris's point. Somebody tried to make the Fifth Amendment applicable to the states. And Marshall, I think it was Marshall, said no. So that's a case worth looking at if you take that perspective that the Bill of Rights is essentially meaningless for a long time.
And if you want to get really nerdy, kids, really nerdy, guess who represented the city of Baltimore? Roger Taney.
I thought it was Taney.
That's what you get for thinking.
Oh, ow. Oh, Taney, potato. You know, it must be chilly up there in Bismarck, North Dakota, making you a little cranky there.
Are you kidding me? Dave, we're +7, baby. I'm going to go out and get some sun.
Yeah. So we have but a few minutes left in this segment. And I'm just curious what you would advise students on the last part of their question here. Because I kind of hate this question, and it comes up very frequently, and it takes me back. I'm talking early years, the late 1980s, early 1990s. We used to get a lot of questions at our district regional events. If you could be a framer, which framer would you be? We get a lot of questions like this. What changes, if any, would you make? Well, yeah, I'd make about 1,000, but let's be grounded, students. There ain't going to be any changes, because the framers in their wisdom created an anti-majoritarian document that has made this, in our day and age, in presentism, it's made it almost virtually impossible to get any substantive changes of the Constitution.
Did you have any
students? My mic on that.
Did you have any students say they wanted to be Luther Martin?
No.
Okay.
I can make something about Melanchthon Smith just because I like the name, Melanchthon.
I guarantee you, none of the boys.
If I would have known about Melanchthon Smith, no. I'll be honest, Chris, I didn't know about these people when my children were born there. So if I would have known the name Melanchthon Smith, one of my children would be named Melanchthon.
Well, I would encourage any students that want to go out and look up Gouverneur Morrison. There's a whalebone incident and some self-cures that you tried to take care of, and I'm going to leave it at that so we can at least be PG-13 on this broadcast. But you go up and read about Gouverneur Morrison, what he did to himself, and you're going to thank God for modern medicine.
So I am curious, Mike and Tim, on your thoughts on the last part of the question. What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? I guess you will play along.
I'll start out with an easier amendment process. I think the Anti-Federalists had it right. The Federalists always argued, hey, we can change this down the road of history, relax. And the Anti-Federalists played the BS card. No, that's a high bar. and that will essentially be meaningless. Another one would, I mean, and now I'll be presentist. I think we needed a little more guidance on high crimes and misdemeanors. So a little more clarity, I think, there, and an easier amendment process.
Uniform.
Well, and that'll be a good conversation with Professor Adler when we see him, I believe, next week. Professor Williams?
Yeah, I think my advice to the students would be, and I've never coached, so I have 3 coaches in the room who might disagree, is that it says what changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution. So my first set of advice would be I would take away what Dave's argument. I would say, look, this question asks us, I'm not telling you what can actually get passed. I'm telling you what changes should be made. And then I think you should think about those changes in terms of a value structure, in terms of what are the principles in your democratic republic. I think you could argue that our Constitution as written was one that was fearful of majority rule and that was meant to preserve liberty at all costs. What would a Constitution look like that maybe was about promoting the general welfare as its first priority? And here's some things I was just thinking about, and I'll just run them off. There's a lot, but I really did think about it. I think the Electoral College is gone. I think we have up or down majority votes for presidents. I think that if we're going to keep the Senate, which maybe we should, it should go back and state legislatures should choose senators so that they're truly representing state interests if we think that's important. I would have the Senate, the president, and all members of the House have 4-year terms, and they'd all run at the same time so that we could focus on elections all at once, and so that we could have governments that would come into power and govern with some idea of policies that would better. And then the 3 other ones I have was independent commissions to draw the districts instead of politicians. I think that the First Amendment should be rewritten to say that money is not speech, and that advocacy of hate is not protected speech. And the reason to go back to my premise was that I think that the general welfare should be the priority. And that if that is your priority, you want to set up a system of government where the politicians can actually govern. And I think that there should be some types of discourse that are just not allowed because it's not for the general welfare. And I would say hatred or advocacy of hatred based on race, gender, ethnicity should be included. So that's my big package, but it was all tied to a certain values that I kind of thought were important. So that's
Professor John Rawls. Professor John Rawls.
We can make some s'mores. I mean, are we going to sit around the campfire here and like?
I didn't write the question, Kavanaugh. I was just responding to it in a responsible way.
Mike, I appreciate your answer, because
right.
I think that's a great challenge for students to approach it that way. What values, right? Because that's a tough thing, and I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm just yanking your chain, but I really appreciate that for students to be able to look at it that way. And maybe I'm just a little jealous that I didn't think of it that way myself. But that's a fantastic way to get kids to think about what values do you want your Constitution to reflect. Yeah, that's fantastic. I still like to have a s'more.
I hate to interrupt this love fest between Professors Kavanaugh and Williams, which has been going on pretty much for the entire segment. But I'm just curious, Professor Williams, would hate on the basis of personality be allowed under your First Amendment? Because I hate you. I'm just curious about that. And this is to students who are watching this. Payback is a bitch. People say, and so you understand. Mr. Williams kind of slapped me down at the beginning of his last answer, because back in 1987, when he was a student in my government class, I just slapped him down every day. And so he's finally getting me back. What is that? 33 years later, something like that. He's getting payback here, by dismissing my entire answer. I appreciate that, Professor Williams. Next time we see you, students, we're going to be talking about question 2 of unit 2, looking at, I love this, Federalist 10, which was written under the influence of opium. And so that'll be a nice conversation. It's been a wonderful day. We'll see you next time. Next bat place, next bat question. Peace, love, yogurt, tacos. See you next week.